Greetings, beloved Princeton United Methodist Church community. It's Pastor Jenny here with an update for you, and I'm reading today from Revelation chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's peoples, and God's self will be with them. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." This is the word of life. Thanks be to God. So as we're nearing the end of Lent and our particular focus on Sabbath, restoring our Sabbath practices so that we might be restored, I wonder if it might be helpful to work to put Sabbath in the context of some bigger things. So in the context of our day-to-day lives, but also in the context of the bigger kingdom work that God is doing. And always calling us to do with God. You know, we've named Sabbath as a practice that is part of our Jubilee community practices in our vision. Now, I know that phrase, that Jubilee community, is one that we're still learning. We're still working out what that means and what that looks like. But the idea is that it takes this Jubilee thread from the Old Testament, from the book of Leviticus, but even something that starts really in the creation story and goes all the way through. Jesus picks it up, and as Jesus is creating Jesus's own community, this alternative community, people who are living and trusting in God and one another in particular ways with this radical trust and this radical hospitality. These practices that Jesus keeps inviting us into are the very practices that were talked about in the Jubilee context back in the Old Testament. So these are the practices that Jesus invites us into. They're kingdom building practices. They're the practices that orient us to being God's people in the world. And these are things that really are meant to be woven into the fabric of our lives. They are things that we have to work at. That's why they're called practices, right? We practice them, we work at them, we learn how to do them through doing them. But they're also not just things that we can check off a list and are done. This past Sunday, we talked about the story of the rich young ruler from Matthew's gospel. And he comes and he asks Jesus, I've done all these things. I've kept all these laws. I've gone beyond the 10 Commandments. I love my neighbor. I have done all these things. What more do I need to do? It's as if he's coming to Jesus and saying, I'm sure there's more. Give me the list. I'll get to work on them and we'll be good. I'll gain more of this life that I'm seeking. But Jesus doesn't just give him something simple, doesn't give him a list, doesn't give him things that are easily checked off of a box. He asks him to go and sell all that he has and give his possessions to the poor. And while in a technical way, maybe that's something you could check off and do, it's meant for something more than that. It's meant to reorient this man's life to be a life of radical trust in God, radical trust in a community, radical connection with God and with the community, and which includes the poor. It's a reorienting of all the things that we hold most dear in life. And so Sabbath is meant to do this. It's meant to reorient the way we are in connection with God and with one another. And it's meant to expand our community of care, including the poor, including those who are outcast, the orphan and the widow and the stranger, and all those who society pushes to the margins. I know that often we tend to think about our Christian practices, those things that we do to follow Jesus, as things that we can kind of mark off of a list, things that are measurable, things that we can claim that we do and do well and that we've achieved. But Jesus invites us into these practices in a way that is ever growing, ever learning, ever changing, ever deepening our relationship with God. The Revelation piece that I read talks about how God dwells among us and we are God's people. We let God be God. And this is a bringing us full circle. The very last part of the book of the Bible brings us to the very first part, this reorientation to how life is meant to be this delight and this presence, this enjoyment of God and God's providence and God's deliverance and God's life with us. So as we continue to think about Sabbath, as we continue to practice and find our way into renewed and restored Sabbath practices, I hope that we cannot just think of it as something to accomplish, something that we can check off a list, something that we can claim, I've done it, I've got it now, I do this and I'm done, I've done it well, what's the next thing? But something that we continually are incorporating more and more into, discovering more about, letting it work in us and through us to reorient us to a whole way of living. I know that when we think about Sabbath, or maybe when we did a few weeks ago, at least, it was something that, seemed very discreet, right? I rest or I don't rest. I'm choosing this for myself. I'm choosing this in these different ways. I'm going to try this little thing. But as we continue to talk about it, I hope that we can see it in this much more expansive way. It is an integral part of being God's people. It is an integral part of letting God be God and us being God's people. It is an integral part of being in the kingdom of God, of orienting ourselves to God and to one another in new ways. Sabbath isn't just this discrete little thing that we do that's between God and us. It is something that is part of the fabric of our lives as God's people and as followers of Jesus, as disciples. So may we continue to play with this. May we continue to look at the ways that Sabbath is so much bigger and more expansive and more invitational than we might have thought before. I invite you to continue with your Sabbath practices, of course, but your Lenten disciplines that may be in addition to that. We still have our Tuesday service midweek at noon on Tuesday. I hope you'll join us. I get to lead this week. And then next Sunday's Palm Sunday, and then we have Holy Week, and you have all sorts of information about that. I also hope you'll take that Easter invitation card that was given to you in worship yesterday, or text message to you Sunday evening, and that you will find a person or multiple people to invite to worship on Easter Sunday, with the hope that they might become part of this beloved community called Princeton United Methodist Church. Friends, it's always a joy to be on this journey with you, and I am always grateful to know that you're there and that we are in this together. Remember that you are created for joy, you were created for delight, and you are enough. We are all enough because God is enough. Thanks be to God for that.